So Robert and Joseph, what would be really great, we have a very short period of time, but what would be really interesting for people is to have a bit of time for questions, but also I would really like each of you to give your perspective on something that we really want to talk about today is what do you think needs to happen with respect to a pilot in this area? So to hear just from both of you on that, would be a really great opening, and then we can open up to more questions, and we'll see how many people we have. We may be able to just allow people to put up their hand and say their own questions, but we'll start off using the chat as we have previously.
I'd be super fascinated to hear, Robert, what you think would need to happen to do a pilot in the region and sort of tactical directions that you might take to that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what I said earlier, my feeling is that a lot of people on this call, a lot of us are doing actual work already in a variety of fields, whether it's as simple as conserving our own property or whether it's creating a kelp or seagrass project or whatever. And that to me, the most important thing is not necessarily to do a project per se, where you go through all the steps and get offsets and so on, but to monitor and measure and recognize the carbon aspect of what you're doing and start to put some numbers around it, start to put some data around it. This business that I talked about earlier of everybody being a sense a citizen scientist, to me, that's the most important thing we can do now in terms of a pilot project. It's really to recognize that all of our projects are pilot projects and to start quantifying what we're doing and how we're doing it and how it's working, because that's the biggest piece that's missing, actually, is not the ability to do a carbon project per se. It's the ability to know what impact we're having.
Would you segment, so given that usually an offset protocol will sort of have its boundaries for what type of activities can be included in one specific project or even in a program of activities where it's a bunch of disparate locations but all sharing a common reality, how many potential what would you slice up as the different project opportunities broadly with present and future offset protocol availability in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we're probably going to get to the point where anything you do with forests is going to be more or less able to be put together into a program of activity. In other words, you can coalesce all those forest projects into a single item. I do think that when we get to wetlands or grasslands, if we're doing some of that kind of work and let's face it, camas meadows and that kind of thing are really important here, and we should be looking at those, that those may well be a different set of activities, a different protocol, and looking at different things, because there suddenly soil becomes the dominant player. And then clearly the wetland is another category because of the methane issues, and really the true blue carbon. So the saltwater marsh all the way out to deep water is another category. And whether that will end up being one or more categories in terms of how we think about carbon sequestration, I don't think we're clear yet.
Awesome. I would agree with all of that. And I think another thing that I would want to add to, how to look at what needs to happen is also just, and I'm sure that this is happening at a certain level, and then I think putting it into the carbon lens is starting to map out the opportunity, say, for those three types of projects. So start to really look at which forests are potentially available and in fact available for project deployment. And I think that that'll be aggregating a lot of small and modest sized forests. It's interesting the work that Community Forest International has done in the maritime forests, where they've really kind of cracked that nut at how to get a bunch of private landowners wrangled together. And so I think that starting to look at that potential scope and scale, and people laddering up their scientific understanding as citizen scientists, as Robert's really made the case for, can then start to get some numbers on the table around, can this theoretically work as an offset project? And if yes, great. If that provides information that can build a project that gets funded by a federal government through a Natural Climate Solutions Fund, great. And if it builds up information where maybe the climate impact is not sufficient to make it go, but that it has other really earnest drivers, then you've now aggregated all of that information to really tell that story about the benefits that happen on that landscape.
Exactly. No, totally agree.
Ruth, did you want to, I guess we don't have any, does anybody want to ask some questions, I think is on the menu here.
Yeah, let's see if we've got any questions. People are welcome to put questions in, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly. I may have to give permission for that. Let me just.
One thing,
while people are thinking about questions, let me just put one more challenge out there that I really see. And as I say, I live on Gabriola, so I'm seeing very parallel stuff. The challenge that strikes me that we all need to think about, and again, this goes back to the citizen science, but it also goes to what we mean by a carbon project. And forgetting his name now from New Brunswick, put it really well. It is also how we understand what the impacts of climate change are being on our ecosystem and how we understand the dynamics of carbon in that context. And, I gave the example earlier of all the tree species in many areas that we're losing entirely. What do we do about that, both from an ecological point of view, but also from a carbon point of view? And so I think we could do pilot projects which are as much focused at adaptation as they are at sequestration, and those would also be incredibly valuable to understand the context of how we're going to get to where we're going. And let me give a crazy example, not from this area. This is from up in the northeast of our province, but I'm working in an area there with First Nations where they have obviously a deep and long traditional relationship with their landscape, and they still are very much living a traditional lifestyle, more so than is possible down here. They still hunt and gather for a great portion of their subsistence. And so their goal really is to preserve their landscape and as much as possible, as it has been since time immemorial. Unfortunately, climate change is going to make that nearly impossible. And the example I'm talking about, they're living in a southern boreal environment. So we're talking the dominant tree species being jack pine and white and black spruce and aspen and so on. And the best projections we have of what's going to happen in their environment over the next 80 years is that it's going to turn into a Rocky Mountain Douglas fir environment. That's a radical environment change. And we're facing that here on these Gulf Islands as well. And so I think we need to be thinking really seriously about that too. Like, as an example of where I live here, my property, was Douglas fir, dominated by very, very large Douglas fir, logged in the 1920s probably. Understory cedar were released. I now have meter diameter cedar that are 120 years old. They're dying. And what greatest likelihood is that my property in 80 years from now will be a Gary Oak ecosystem. How do we manage that? And how do we think about that, both in terms of our communities, in terms of our ecosystems, and in terms of carbon?
One of the things when this reality comes up in conversations with me, people will use it as a reason not to do a carbon offset project, not to do a climate project. And it confounded me for a little while until I realized that this reality that we are undergoing climate change and that it is causing ecological change is a reason to double down on doing smart, wise development of climate projects, of engaging with the potential for landscapes to sequester and store carbon, rather than just throwing our hands up, both because there are steepening baselines where if we actually can create durable realities on the landscape, that we can have really strong climate benefit, but also that the inverse is just like throwing our hands up and giving up. I don't think, that's not my way to roll. I don't think it's anybody's here's way to roll. And so it really highlights the importance of natural climate solutions. It deepens the highlights the need to be citizen scientists, to be engaged, to understand what's happening on your landscape, and find positive pathways out of it, rather than just throwing up our hands. One of the things that I'm really excited about these days is where we can arc out from what we've learned in developing the methodologies and protocols and real projects on the ground of carbon offsets, and where we can take that learning forward. So it'll be rare to meet a bigger booster of offsets than myself. And that's largely because I've got to see the great work that they've enabled on the landscape, in community, and in the atmosphere. But I also recognize that it would be great if we just had regulation where government said, thou shalt protect this landscape, thou shalt do adaptive management. And offsets are not a reason not to push for that. I don't think anybody who works in offsets would ever say, we just need to do offsets and nothing else. And so I think that's a bit of a boogeyman. One of the really creative pathways that some folks and I are working on moving forward actually really pivots out of some work, Robert, that you and I had done or tried to do in relation to British Columbia and the and work that had an investment that had been made in wildfire and beetle kill areas, Forest Enhancement Society of BC. So almost $400 million got put aside to support better climate outcomes on landscapes that had been affected by fire and by beetle kill, which, in concept is a great idea. But what we saw was that there were limited tools available either to the people with the purse strings, as well as to the people proposing projects, to actually be able to really estimate the carbon impact of their work, and then be able to report on it. And, our fear was, and I think that's been borne out, is without those tools and those lenses, it's very difficult to focus on projects and to select projects that really do have a strong climate impact. I recognize there are lots of other important impacts, but if we're doing things in the name of climate, my position is we need to be really clear what that climate impact is. And so we almost got there in getting the go-ahead to put together a toolkit and getting that deployed, but that kind of got scuttled at the last minute, which was unfortunate. That experience has carried through with me to watching the federal government slowly move and now start to jog towards implementing natural climate solutions. We've all heard about the 2 billion tree program, and there's also been additional $600 million committed earlier this spring towards deploying natural climate solutions as well as building systems. I think Elizabeth May was intimating that there's more good stuff coming down the pike. And this is great. And, I've advocated for this. Robert's advocated for this. I know a lot of people have advocated for the federal government leaning in this regard. Now that they're starting to do it, this is good, but I really believe that we need to help establish toolkits for the government to be able to do intakes based on quality estimates of the carbon impact of the work, and then be able to report on that impact as it happens, to really audit and verify that impact. Both because of course they should, and Canadians would want to see that. There's another subset of it, which I hope to drive increased urgency on the federal government's part, which is that just in 2020, they've started including the carbon impact of a portion of our forests and natural systems in Canada towards our Paris Agreement commitments. So up until 2020, they were counting it, but they did not apply it in our pathway to Paris or towards that 30% or whatever reduction. With their inclusion of a portion of Canada's landscapes, they call it anthropogenically managed landscapes, I see an opportunity here where if we can be having the outcomes of these investments in nature be quantified and reported in a way that gets Canada closer to its Paris goals, then that becomes, it becomes money in the bank, or it becomes money that doesn't have to get spent. It becomes a carbon tax that doesn't have to go quite so high, or regulations quite so steep, or in reality, it just means that we have a hope and heck of meeting our commitments. And so we're working at EcoTrust Canada, where I work, to try to pull these strings together and provide some suggestions and some pathways for the federal government to be able to take all of this good carbon offset work and the diligence that's been built up around the folks in the field and apply it as we move forward to try to help there be better investments in nature in Canada. Thanks.
Questions, anyone?
I think people just want to hear what your thinking is. I haven't seen any questions. People have the option to unmute and ask a question if they want. I've taken away the mutes, but in the meanwhile, we've got 4 more minutes, and my interpretation from the audience is they'd like to hear. So what do we do next? That would be my question. Is I hear what you're saying, and what we're looking for Transition Salt Spring and those of us that were involved in pulling this together is to bring people together and figure out what is the most important thing we could do.
Yeah, and I think what Joseph just said is really important in that regard, and it goes back to what I had said. And to me, the most important thing that you could do is to do the things that you need to do to have a sustainable ecosystem going forward. In other words, I don't think that the project should be inherently driven by carbon. Carbon should be an outcome, but I don't think that in our very limited landscapes that we have on the Gulf Islands here, for instance, we're ever going to do massive scale carbon projects that are going to make massive scale differences to the atmosphere. There's lots of opportunities to do that in Canada, not so much here. This is a very limited ecosystem with a lot of private land, a lot of settlements. So to me, the important thing is, one, what can you do to improve the sustainability long-term of your ecosystem? And B, what data can you gather, what I've been harping on, and C, that then feeding into exactly what Joseph was just saying, which is, and then taking that knowledge and that data and that experience and using that to understand what the carbon outputs, what the atmospheric outputs and the global warming outputs are of the things that we do. So I wouldn't start by prioritizing a project because it has a positive carbon outcome. I'd start prioritizing a project because it's high priority for sustainability and for ecological health, and then figuring out what the carbon outcome is.
And I do think, fortunately, there are pathways there on the Gulf Islands and in the CDF. One thing I'll point people at is Quadra Island did a successful carbon offset project, the BC Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, in protecting landscape that was going to be developed for housing. And it's a small project. They had support of Van City to really help bridge that and make that a possibility. So there is, recognition that there is a scrappy upstart aspect of this. But as Robert's saying, if we can pull together a really compelling project or set of projects and activities, carbon is one of the values. There are many other values, some of which can be financial, some of which are emotive, but clarifying what can be done and what can be done with the money and investment also can lead to finding support from conventional and unconventional places to make the whole ball move. And I do think that the Great Bear Rainforest, if we unpack it a little bit, carbon offsets were a critical piece, but they are, amongst some other really big pieces of pie of what made that happen. The clarity of the Indigenous communities, the clarity of the environmental movement, pathways to get the heart logging folks on board. So it's really a constellation. It's beautiful, pearls amongst the great, amongst the Salish Sea, just like the islands. But getting them all, rowing together, I think that there's really amazing potential, and really proud and excited for the work that all of you folks are doing to try to bring this to reality.
Wow. Thank you. This is, I think this is going to be music to all of us that have been working on this as ears to take that approach. And maybe I'll just share that some of the ways we've been thinking about this has been to talk to those who don't normally participate in these conversations. So talking about fire and what we can do to reduce the risk of fire, and how important our natural stable ecosystems are, and the role of that. So the education side, and then the other is water. Whenever I give a presentation, I always ask what the people think are the most important issues, and fire and water, they're always the top of the list. And so we're starting to focus on a different audience and communicating that, and so this is great because we're starting to put pieces. I wonder if maybe what would be, we have so much experience participating today, and I wonder if one of the things we could do would be to focus on the measuring and the learning, and have a whole bunch of nodes, and then somehow create a network of sharing and also communicating, so we're not investing a lot of the same resources to tell the same story if someone has already developed something very good for it, or we can try technique, or get access to someone who has experience.
Totally a great idea. And I think a sharing portal, a sharing modality, a sharing something or other, so that all of us within the Salish Sea area can share as we learn, would be huge. Yeah, a huge benefit. You know, that could be as simple as a website that people are able to contribute to. But yeah, it would be great. Would be somewhat unique in my experience. Yeah.
I have to say I'm optimistic for, some of the folks on the broader call and these working groups, that they will be galloping hard post this to work on wrangling people into formation. So that's a hope, but also an earnest belief. So, if they come calling, pick up the phone and see what you can do to help.
Yes.
David Oxley, I work with Great Bear Carbon Credit. And our experience is carbon's really complicated and complex. It's workable, and we'd be happy to help out. Our projects have been running since 2009, and the others since 2011. So there's a fair bit of history.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. And I think this is something that Transition Salt Spring can do. There's the people who will do the numbers and the crunching, and there's the politicians, and then there's a role for others to help bring people together and get the information and make sure the right people are brought together and the information is shared. So thank you so much, Joseph and Robert and everyone. This has been a wonderful day.